The silence before. Minutes 60 to 55. The wind had stopped. Throk noticed it first. For 37 summers, he had listened to the mountain winds howl through the valley below their cave. And in all that time, the wind had never simply stopped. Not like this. Not in the middle of the day when the sun still blazed white against the limestone cliffs. He stood at the cave mouth, his massive frame blocking most of the light that filtered into their home, and felt something ancient stirring in his blood. Something his grandfather's grandfather had known. Something that whispered one word through the generations: danger. The cave behind him housed 23 souls, 23 Neanderthals who represented something the world would not know for another 40,000 years. They were the last, the absolute last of their kind in this entire region of what future humans would call southern France. But Throk did not know this. He knew only that his family had lived in this cave for more generations than anyone could count, that the paintings on the walls showed hunts from times when his ancestors were young, and that something was profoundly wrong with the silence. Mira emerged from the deeper chambers, carrying their daughter Kale on her hip. At 3 summers old, Kale had her mother's striking red hair, a trait that marked their family line, and her father's powerful build already showing in her sturdy legs. Mira's eyes met Throk's, and he saw his own unease reflected there. She had felt it too. The wrongness. "The birds," she said quietly in their guttural language, a tongue that would die with them and leave no trace except perhaps in the deepest structures of human speech. "They stopped singing an hour ago." Throk nodded slowly. His hand moved unconsciously to the spear that never left his side, a weapon tipped with flint so perfectly napped that it could pierce mammoth hide. He had made it himself during the long winter, sitting by the fire while the elders told stories of the old days when their people had ranged across vast territories and never feared the tall, thin strangers who sometimes appeared on the horizon. But that was before the strangers became many, before they started appearing in larger groups with their strange weapons and stranger eyes, before 3 caves in the neighboring valleys had gone silent over the past 5 years. Throk's father, Gron, emerged from the shadows. At 58 summers he was ancient by their reckoning, his body bent and scarred from a lifetime of hunting cave bears and battling the great cats that prowled the night. But his mind remained sharp, sharper than any blade. He had survived by reading signs that other hunters missed. "They are coming," Gron said flatly. Not a question, a statement of fact. "You have seen them?" Throk asked, though he already knew the answer. "No, but I have seen everything else leave. The wolves left before dawn. The deer scattered from the valley. Even the crows have abandoned their roosts." Gron's scarred hand gripped Throk's shoulder. "When all the animals flee, only prey remains." Deep in the cave, life continued with desperate normalcy. Old Kira, the eldest at 62 summers, tended the eternal fire that had burned in this cave for longer than memory. The flames had never been allowed to die, passed from generation to generation, a sacred trust. Near her, 4 children played with carved bone figurines, acting out hunting scenes they had watched the adults perform. Their laughter echoed off stone walls covered in ochre handprints, each one a testament to the thousands who had lived and died in this place. Young Brock, barely 16 summers and newly permitted to join the hunts, worked on scraping a deer hide with his brothers. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, but his eyes kept darting to the cave entrance where the 3 senior males stood. He had heard the whispers. Everyone had. Stories of the other ones, the tall strangers with high foreheads and weak bodies who somehow killed from distances that should have been impossible. Stories of caves found empty, their inhabitants vanished, or worse. Throk turned back to scan the valley below. Their cave sat high on a limestone cliff, a natural fortress that had protected his people for countless generations. Below, the river glinted in the afternoon sun, winding through a valley thick with oak and birch. In autumn, this valley would explode with color. In winter, it became a death trap of ice and hunger. Now, in late summer, it should have been alive with game preparing for the cold months ahead. It was empty. Not a single deer grazed in the meadows. No ibex picked their way along the cliff faces. The fishing eagles that nested in the tall pines were gone. The valley had been evacuated by every creature with the sense to flee, and Throk's people had missed the warning signs until now. Or perhaps they had seen them and refused to believe. This cave was their world. Their ancestors had been born in its chambers, painted on its walls, and been laid to rest in its deepest recesses. The thought of abandoning it was like considering the abandonment of breathing itself. "How long?" Throk asked his father. Gron tilted his head, reading signs invisible to younger eyes. The angle of light, the temperature of the stone, the way dust motes moved in the still air. "They will attack before the sun sets, maybe sooner. They prefer to strike when we can see our deaths coming." A chill ran through Throk despite the summer warmth. He had encountered the others only twice before in his life. The first time, he had been a boy of 8 summers, and his father had led a hunting party that stumbled upon a camp of the strangers. There had been no fight. Both groups had simply stared at each other across a meadow, each recognizing something simultaneously familiar and utterly alien in the other. Then his father had slowly backed away, and the others had let them go. The second encounter, 5 summers ago, had been different. Throk and 2 companions had tracked a wounded mammoth for 3 days, finally cornering it in a canyon. They had been preparing to make the kill when others appeared on the canyon rim above them. 15 of them. 20. More. They had looked down with those strange, flat faces and calculating eyes, and then one had raised a weapon unlike any Throk had seen. A thin shaft had come flying through the air, propelled by a flex of wood and sinew that allowed it to travel 3 times farther than any thrown spear. The shaft had buried itself in the ground between Throk's feet. A warning. They had abandoned the mammoth and run. When Throk had looked back from a safe distance, the others were efficiently butchering the animal with stone tools that seemed no different from his own. That was what haunted him in the dark times. They were not so different. They made tools, they hunted, they cared for their young. But in their eyes, he had seen something his people lacked. A hunger not for food, but for space, for dominance, for everything. Now that hunger was coming to his cave. "We should run," Mira said, her voice tight with fear as she clutched Kale closer. "Take what we can carry and go. The high passes are still open. We could reach the northern territories." Throk wanted to agree. Every instinct screamed at him to grab his daughter and flee. But Gron shook his head slowly. The northern territories belong to others now. The eastern valleys, too. The western mountains are held by the Red Hand clan of our people, but they are dying. I heard their signal fires go dark last spring. The old hunter's voice carried the weight of terrible knowledge. There is nowhere left to run. This may be the last cave of our people in all the world. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. In the back of his mind, in that place where instinct and awareness merged, Throk felt the truth of it. They were not just a family facing danger. They were a species approaching extinction, and some deep genetic wisdom recognized the moment for what it was. 55 minutes remained, though they had no way to measure time so precisely. The sun had moved perhaps the width of 2 fingers across the sky since Throk had first noticed the silence. In the valley below, shadows were beginning to lengthen. In those shadows, invisible to the Neanderthals above, shapes were moving. Shapes that walked on 2 legs and carried weapons capable of killing from distances that violated every rule of hunting that Throk's people had learned over 300,000 years of existence. Inside the cave, old Kara fed another branch to the eternal flame. The fire crackled and popped, sending shadows dancing across ancient paintings of aurochs and mammoths. She did not know that in less than 1 hour, her flame would go out for the first time in millennia. She knew only that something felt wrong, and so she sang. An old song in their old language, a song of protection and blessing that her grandmother had taught her, and her grandmother's grandmother before that. The words of the song would die with her. The melody would vanish from the earth. And in 40,000 years, when archaeologists would excavate this cave and find the ash layer from this exact day, they would have no way of knowing that the last native song of Homo neanderthalensis had been sung here, in these final minutes before the attack. Throk made his decision. "Get everyone to the deep chamber," he commanded. "Now! Bring weapons, bring fire, bring the children. Leave everything else." Mira's eyes widened. The deep chamber was where they kept their dead, where the walls were painted with the most sacred images, where the air itself felt heavy with the presence of ancestors. It was taboo to take the living there, except in the most extreme circumstances. "You think it will come to that?" she whispered. Throk did not answer. He was staring at the valley, at a place where the trees seemed to be moving in a way that had nothing to do with wind. His grip tightened on his spear until his knuckles went white. "We have very little time," Gran said quietly. "Perhaps less than we think." He was right. In the valley below, 68 Homo Sapiens warriors had already begun their advance. They moved with coordinated precision that would have been impossible for Neanderthal hunting parties, communicating with hand signals and bird calls that carried complex tactical information. Their leader, a tall man named Kesh, who would never appear in any history book, raised his hand in a stopping gesture. The warriors froze. Kesh looked up at the cave, at the massive figure of Throk silhouetted against the light. His face showed no anger, no hatred, no emotion at all. This was not personal. This was simply what his people did. They found territories occupied by the thick, strong others, and they took those territories. Sometimes through intimidation, sometimes through violence. The method did not matter. Only the result mattered. He made a sharp gesture. The warriors began to spread out, encircling the base of the cliff. They moved with the patience of those who knew they had already won. There was no rush. The others in that cave had nowhere to go. The cliff was unclimbable from below. There was only one entrance, and that entrance would soon be theirs. Above, in the cave, Throk began organizing the evacuation to the deep chamber. Mothers grabbed children. Young men seized weapons. The elderly moved as quickly as their ancient joints would allow, and old Kara, still singing her protection song, carefully scooped hot coals into a clay pot to carry the eternal flame deeper into the earth. 55 minutes. The last hour of the Neanderthals' world had begun. The gathering storm. Minutes 55 to 45. Throk moved through the cave like a winter storm, his voice low and urgent as he roused his people from their afternoon tasks. There was no time for explanation, no time for the long discussions that usually governed important decisions among his kind. The younger ones sensed his fear and obeyed instantly. The elders moved more slowly, their faces showing confusion and resistance. "We do not hide in the deep chamber," protested Dura, a weathered woman of 49 summers who had birthed 7 children in this cave. Her hands were busy weaving a basket from willow strips, a task she had been in the middle of when Throk's command came. "That place is for the dead, for ceremony, not for the living." "Today it is for survival," Throk replied, his eyes never leaving the cave entrance where his father still stood watch. "Gather your children, move quickly." Dura's mate, Throk, rose to his full height. He was nearly as large as Throk, his shoulders broader still, his arms thick with muscle earned from a lifetime of throwing spears and wrestling prey to the ground. In his prime, he had killed a cave lion with only a stone knife after his spear shattered. He was not a male who took orders easily. "You speak of survival, but you give us no enemy to fight," Throk rumbled. "What do you see that we do not?" It was a fair question, asked in the way of their people. Among Neanderthals, authority came not from age alone, but from demonstrated wisdom. A leader who could not explain his decisions would not remain a leader for long. But Throk had no time for their ways. The old customs, the careful consensus, the long deliberations around the fire. These were luxuries of a world that no longer existed. "The others are in the valley," he said flatly. "Many of them. Moving toward us now." Silence crashed through the cave like a physical force. Even the children stopped playing. The name, others, carried weight that transcended language. It was not a word they used often, because to speak of the others was to acknowledge a truth too terrible to contemplate, that they were no longer alone in the world, that something else, something strange and numerous and patient, wanted what they had. Hirok's expression changed. The challenge left his eyes, replaced by something older and deeper. "You are certain?" "My father has read the signs. The animals have fled. The birds are silent. And I have seen—" Throk paused, choosing his words carefully. "I have seen movement in the trees, movement that is not wind." Mira had already begun moving, directing the other women to gather the children. She knew her mate well enough to hear the thing he was not saying, that this was not a raid or a confrontation over hunting territories. This was something final, something that had been building for generations and was now cresting like a wave that would crush them all. Young Brock approached Throk with his 2 brothers, Dern and Crag. All 3 held spears, their young faces trying to mask fear with bravado. At 16, 15, and 14 summers, respectively, they had hunted deer and ibex, but never faced human enemies. Their grandfather had taught them to track and stalk. Their father had shown them how to read the land, but no one had prepared them for this. "Do we fight?" Brock asked, his voice cracking slightly. He was still growing, his body caught between boyhood and the massive frame he would have achieved in another 5 years. But he would never get those 5 years. Throk looked at the 3 brothers and felt his heart twist. They were good boys, strong, clever. They deserved to live long lives, to take mates, to father children. to pass their knowledge to another generation. But the world no longer cared what anyone deserved. "If fighting comes, you will be ready," Throk said carefully. "But first, we secure the women and children. We move to defensible ground. We survive long enough to understand what we face." It was the answer of a leader trying to preserve hope while preparing for slaughter. The brothers nodded and moved to help with the evacuation, but Throk saw the understanding in young Brock's eyes. The boy was clever enough to know that when you moved to defensible ground, it meant your current position was already lost. At the cave entrance, Gron had been joined by two other senior males. Mac, a grizzled hunter of 47 summers, with a face scarred by a bear's claws, and Torg, younger at 39, but missing his left eye from an encounter with a wolverine that had nearly killed him. The three of them represented the fighting strength of the clan's older generation, males who had survived decades in a world that killed most before they reached 30. "How many?" Mac asked quietly, his good eye scanning the valley. "I cannot count them," Gron admitted. "They move like shadows, like water flowing between stones. But I have seen at least 30, and I think there are more." Torg spat over the cliff edge, a gesture of contempt that barely masked his fear. 30 of them against 23 of us, and 8 of ours are children. The math is poor." "The math was always poor," Gron replied. "We are stronger, yes, tougher. We can survive cold that would kill them, hunger that would break them. But they are more, always more. For every one of them we see, there are 10 more beyond the horizon. For every 10, there are 100. They breed like rabbits and spread like grass fire." It was the longest speech any of them had heard Gron make in years. The old hunter was not given to philosophy or grand pronouncements. That he spoke so now, so freely about their doom, told them everything they needed to know about his assessment of their chances. Inside the cave, the evacuation to the deep chamber had taken on desperate momentum. The women had wrapped the youngest children in furs despite the summer heat, preparing for a siege that might last days in the cold depths of the cave. They grabbed bags of dried meat, bladders of water, essential tools. Old Kara moved slowly but steadily, her precious pot of coals held carefully before her, her lips still moving in that ancient song of protection. The deep chamber lay through a narrow passage at the back of the main cave. The passage was barely wide enough for a large male to squeeze through, which was exactly why Throk had chosen it. If the others broke through the main entrance, they would have to come through that choke point one at a time, and Neanderthal males in a narrow space were nearly impossible to overcome. Their superior upper body strength, their incredible grip power, their ability to grapple and crush, all these advantages multiplied in tight quarters. But that assumed the others would come to them, that they would fight the traditional way, body to body, strength against strength. Throk was not sure they would be so accommodating. As the women and children filed into the narrow passage, Throk took stock of his fighting males. Himself, his father Gron, Hrok and his son Dern, who at 15 was already strong enough to hunt with the men, Mac, Torg, young Brock and his brother Crag. That made 8 males of fighting age, ranging from 14 summers to 58. 8 males to hold a cave against at least 30 enemies. Enemies who could kill from distance. Enemies who seemed to possess an endless capacity for patience and planning. Enemies who had been slowly, methodically eliminating every other Neanderthal clan in the region for the past decade. "We need scouts," Hrok said, materializing beside Throk. "We need to know where they are, how many, what weapons they carry." Throk shook his head. "Leave the cave now, and we will not return. They will be waiting. They have been watching us for days, maybe weeks. They know our hunting patterns, our water sources, our movements. This attack is not random. It was a chilling thought, and Throk saw it register on Hrok's face. The idea that they had been observed, studied, analyzed like prey animals before the kill. It violated something fundamental about how they saw themselves. They were the hunters, the apex predators. They feared nothing except starvation and the great cats. To be reduced to prey, to be stalked by something that walked and talked and made tools, it was almost incomprehensible. "Then we are trapped," Hrok said quietly. "We are fortified," Throk corrected. "There is a difference." But even as he said it, he wondered if he believed his own words. Yes, the cave was defensible. Yes, they had food and water for several days. Yes, the narrow passages gave them tactical advantages. But defenders only won when relief was coming, when time worked in their favor. And time, Throk suspected, was entirely on the side of the others. A sound from the valley made all three males at the cave entrance stiffen. It was a bird call, too perfect, too rhythmic. Not quite right in ways that only someone who had spent their entire life listening to birds would notice. "They are signaling to each other," Gran said. "Coordinating. They do this. They speak across distances without showing themselves." Another call answered the first, from a different part of the valley. Then another. The Homo Sapiens warriors were reporting to their leader, confirming positions, establishing a perimeter. They were encircling the cliff with the methodical efficiency of wolves, cutting off a mammoth's escape routes. Throk made a decision. "Everyone inside, now. Seal the entrance." "Seal it?" Mac looked shocked. "If we seal the entrance, we trap ourselves. We are already trapped. But if we seal it partially, we create a barrier. We force them to break through on our terms in a place where we choose to fight." It was sound, tactical thinking, but it represented something more profound. The acknowledgement that this was not a temporary danger to be waited out. This was a siege, a final stand. The last chapter of a story that had been unfolding for 300,000 years. The males moved quickly, rolling heavy stones into the cave entrance. Not blocking it completely, that would suffocate them, but creating a defensive wall with a narrow opening at one side. As they worked, Throk caught glimpses of the valley below. The shadows had grown longer. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, and in those lengthening shadows, he saw them. Figures. Human figures, but wrong. Too tall, too thin, moving with a fluidity that looked almost feminine compared to the powerful, stomping gait of Neanderthal males. They wore animal skins like his people did, carried spears like his people did. Even their faces had a strange familiarity. But the proportions were all wrong. The foreheads too high, the jaws too small, the bodies too gracile and weak-looking. Yet there were so many of them. Throk counted 20 visible figures, but the way they moved suggested many more in the forest. They were not hiding anymore. They wanted to be seen. They wanted the Neanderthals to know they were surrounded, to feel the noose tightening. Psychological warfare. Another innovation the others had brought to this world. The last stone was rolled into place. The cave entrance was now a defensive position, with clear sightlines and a narrow killing ground. Any enemy trying to force through would face spears and stones and the crushing strength of Neanderthal arms. It should have felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like a tomb being sealed from the inside. Mira appeared at Throk's side, having settled Kale and the other children in the deep chamber. Her face was streaked with ochre dust from the painted walls, and her eyes held a question she was afraid to ask. "How long can we hold?" she whispered. Throk wanted to lie, wanted to promise her safety, promise her that dawn would find them alive and the others retreating. But he had never lied to his mate, and he would not start now. "I do not know, but I will die before I let them reach you and Kale." It was not the answer she wanted, but it was the truth. Mira nodded slowly and pressed her forehead against his chest in the gesture of trust that their people used. Then she turned and disappeared back toward the deep chamber, where the women were organizing a last redoubt, preparing for horrors they could barely imagine. From the valley below, another bird call echoed off the limestone cliffs. It was answered by 3 others, forming a pattern that clearly communicated something complex. The others had finished their preparations. 45 minutes had passed since the wind stopped. 15 minutes since Throk had ordered the evacuation. The sun was now 2 hand-widths above the western mountains, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber that would have been beautiful under any other circumstances. Gran stood beside his son, his scarred hands resting on a spear that had killed more game than anyone could count. "When I was young," he said quietly, "my grandfather told me a story. He said that long ago, in the times before memory, the world was bigger. There was room for everyone, room for our people, room for the animals, room for the spirits in the stones. But the world has been growing smaller my whole life. Every summer there is less space, less game, more others. I think—" He paused, struggling with a thought too large for words. "I think the world is not big enough for both of us. I think one must leave so the other can stay." "We have left," Throk said bitterly. "We have moved and moved and moved, always retreating, always finding new caves, new valleys, and still they follow." "Yes, because they do not want us to move. They want us to disappear." The words hung in the air like a prophecy. In the valley below, Kesh raised his hand in a final signal. The encirclement was complete. 68 Homo Sapiens warriors stood ready, armed with spears, atlatls for long-range throwing, stone knives, and clubs. They had numbers. They had tactics. They had time. Most importantly, they had already won this fight before it began. They had won it 10,000 years ago, when their populations began expanding. They had won it in their superior ability to cooperate in large groups, to plan complex operations, to sustain aggression over long periods. The Neanderthals' superior strength was meaningless against enemies who never came within arm's reach. Their superior cold tolerance was irrelevant when the battle would be decided in a single afternoon. Their 300,000 years of successful existence meant nothing in the face of extinction. Kesh lowered his hand. The attack began. The first stone, minutes 45 to 35. The first projectile came without warning. A stone the size of a child's fist arced through the air, tumbling end over end with deadly velocity. It struck the limestone cliff face 3 paces below the cave entrance, shattering with a sharp crack that echoed like breaking bone. Fragments sprayed upward, and one shard caught Torg across the cheek, opening a thin line that immediately began weeping blood. Throk's head snapped toward the valley. There, at the edge of the tree line, nearly 100 paces distant, a figure stood with arms still extended from the throw. 100 paces. An impossible distance. No Neanderthal could throw a stone with force at such range. Their bodies, built for power rather than the whip-like motion required for distance throwing, simply did not have the shoulder architecture for it. But the others did. "Down!" Gran shouted, pulling Mac behind the stone barricade. The warning came just in time. A volley of stones followed the first. At least a dozen projectiles launched in rapid succession. They struck the cliff face, the cave entrance, the barricade itself. One sailed through the narrow opening and clattered against the back wall. causing screams from the women huddled in the deeper chambers. Throk pressed himself against the inner wall, his mind racing. This was not how his people fought. They closed distance. They grappled. They used their superior strength to overwhelm prey and enemy alike. But these others were turning warfare into something abstract, something conducted at range, where strength meant nothing and numbers meant everything. "They are trying to frighten us," Throk growled, wiping dust from his face. "Trying to make us panic and run." "No," Gron said quietly, his experienced eyes reading the tactical situation with terrible clarity. "They are testing our defenses, probing. They want to know how many of us hold the entrance, where we are positioned, how we react. This is not battle. This is preparation for battle." As if to confirm his words, the stone barrage stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Silence reclaimed the valley, broken only by the harsh breathing of the males crouched behind their inadequate barricade. Throk risked a glance around the stone barrier. The figures at the tree line had not moved closer, but they had multiplied. He counted 30 visible now. 40. They were emerging from the forest like ghosts materializing, and with each new figure, the mathematics of survival grew bleaker. "We need to kill one," young Brock said suddenly. His voice was tight with fear, but also with the fierce courage of youth that has not yet learned the full weight of mortality. "If we kill one, the others will know we can fight back. They will fear us." Throk looked at the young male with something like pity. "They already know we can fight. That is why they stay at distance. That is why they throw stones instead of charging. They do not fear us less because we are weak. They fear us precisely because we are strong. So they have found a way to fight where strength does not matter." It was a sophisticated analysis, more strategic thinking than most Neanderthals engaged in. But Throk was not most Neanderthals. He had the misfortune of being clever in a time when cleverness could no longer save his people. He understood, in a way his ancestors never had to, that the world had changed in some fundamental way. That the old methods, the direct confrontation, the test of strength, the honorable combat, were obsolete in the face of an enemy that rewrote the rules of engagement. Mira appeared at the edge of the passage leading deeper, her face pale. "The children are asking what is happening. What do I tell them?" "Tell them we are protecting them," Throk said. "Tell them their fathers are strong. Tell them—" He faltered, searching for words that were both true and comforting. "Tell them a story. The old story about the first hunt. Anything to keep their minds away from here." She nodded and disappeared. Behind him, Throk heard her voice beginning the familiar tale, speaking in the low, rhythmic cadence that all Neanderthal mothers used when soothing frightened young. The story of how the first hunters tracked the great mammoth, how they worked together, how they provided for the clan. It was a story about triumph, about the power and wisdom of their people. It was a story from a world that no longer existed. "Movement," Mac hissed, pointing toward the valley floor. Throk followed his gesture and felt his stomach tighten. A group of others had broken from the tree line and were moving toward the cliff base. Not running, not charging, advancing, with careful, measured steps. They carried something between them. Long poles. No, not poles. Ladders. They had constructed ladders. "The cliff cannot be climbed," Torg said, but his voice lacked conviction. "The stone is too smooth, too high." Gron said nothing, but his expression spoke volumes. The cliff face was indeed steep, nearly vertical in places, But it was not smooth everywhere. There were cracks, ledges, handholds invisible from above, and with ladders to span the most difficult sections, with ropes and cooperation and the patience to try multiple approaches. "They will find a way," Gran finally said. "Maybe not today, maybe not this attempt, but they will keep trying, keep probing, keep testing until they find a weakness. That is what they do." Below, the Homo sapiens warriors had reached the cliff base. Kesh, their leader, examined the stone face with the practiced eye of someone who had conducted this operation before. And he had. 3 times in the past 2 years, his band had laid siege to Neanderthal strongholds. Twice, the defenders had fled during the night, abandoning their homes to avoid annihilation. Once, they had stayed and fought. That cave had taken 2 days to clear. Kesh had lost 3 warriors in the close quarters fighting, including his younger brother. But in the end, they had prevailed. They always prevailed. Not because they were stronger, they were not. Not because they were braver, that was debatable. But because they could afford losses in ways the Neanderthals could not. When a Homo sapiens warrior died, his clan mourned but continued. They had cousins, brothers, allies from other bands. Their populations numbered in the hundreds, the thousands across the wider territory. When a Neanderthal male fell, he might represent 1/5 of his clan's fighting strength. Every death was catastrophic. Every injury potentially fatal to the group's survival. Kesh understood this asymmetry at a level that transcended conscious thought. It was why he never rushed. Why he was willing to spend days, even weeks, reducing a position. Time was his ally, attrition his weapon. The Neanderthals could not replace their losses. He could. He gestured to his warriors, and they began positioning the ladders against the cliff face, probing for viable routes upward. The ladders were crude but functional, lashed together from saplings with sinew cordage. If they broke, the warriors would make more. If the first climbing attempt failed, they would try another route, and another, and another. Persistence, adaptability, numbers. These were the weapons that would win this war. In the cave above, Throk watched the preparations with growing dread. If they reach the ledge below us, they can throw directly into the cave. We will have no cover. Then we must stop them from reaching the ledge, Throk replied. He moved to the barricade opening and hefted a large stone in his massive hand. At this range, even he could not throw with accuracy. But if the others climbed close enough— "Wait," Gran commanded. "Let them commit. Let them think we are passive. Then strike when it will have maximum effect." It was sound strategy, but it required patience that ran contrary to every instinct. To watch enemies approach without responding felt wrong at a visceral level. But Gran had not survived 58 summers by indulging instinct over intelligence. The first other began to climb. He moved with the swift confidence of someone who had done this before, ascending hand over hand with a grace that the heavily muscled Neanderthals could never match. His body was light, his limbs long, his movements economical. He climbed like a spider, and he was not alone. 2 more others had begun ascending different routes, testing multiple approaches simultaneously. "Coordinated assault," Gran muttered. "They learn from each other. Share knowledge. Look, that one on the left uses a technique the others are now copying." He was right. The climbers were adapting in real time, calling out discoveries, adjusting their approaches based on each other's successes and failures. It was a level of tactical cooperation that Neanderthal hunting parties rarely achieved. Neanderthals hunted in groups, yes, but each male relied primarily on his own strength and judgment. The idea of subordinating individual decision-making to group tactics was foreign to them. The lead climber had reached a point 20 paces below the cave entrance. He paused on a narrow ledge, then reached down to help the next climber up. They were establishing a staging area, a platform from which to launch the next phase of the assault. "Now," Gran said quietly. Throk rose from behind the barricade and threw. His arm moved in a powerful arc, and the stone flew true, but slowly. Too slowly. The others saw it coming and pressed flat against the cliff face. The stone whistled past, missing by an arm's length, and tumbled down to shatter on the rocks below. But the throw had served its purpose. The others now knew the defenders were active, were watching, were dangerous. The lead climber looked up at the cave entrance, and even at this distance, Throk could see the calculation in his eyes, the assessment, the measuring. Then the climber did something unexpected. He smiled. It was not a friendly expression. It was the smile of a predator that has cornered its prey and knows the outcome is inevitable. The smile of someone who has done this before and will do it again. The smile of a species that had learned not just to use tools, but to make them. Not just to hunt, but to wage war. Not just to survive, but to dominate. The climber reached behind his back and produced a spear, but not like any spear Throk had seen before. It was lighter, thinner, with a wicked stone point that looked sharp enough to split bone. And at the base of the spear there was a device, a length of wood, with a hook at one end. An atlatl. A spear thrower that multiplied the force and distance of a thrown weapon. "Down!" Throk shouted, but the warning came too late. The climber's arm moved in a smooth, practiced motion. The atlatl extended his reach, added mechanical advantage, allowed him to store and release energy with devastating efficiency. The spear flew from his hand with a velocity that defied belief. It caught Torg in the shoulder, punching through hide and muscle, the stone point embedding itself so deep that only a hand's width of shaft remained visible. The one-eyed hunter let out a roar that was equal parts pain and outrage. He staggered backward, clutching at the shaft, his face contorting as shock gave way to agony. Mac caught him before he fell, lowering him to the cave floor. Blood was already soaking through Torg's tunic, spreading in a dark stain that looked black in the cave's dim light. Throk rushed over, his hands moving to assess the damage, even as his mind reeled at the implications of what had just happened. An enemy had struck them from 20 paces away, had injured a full-grown male warrior without coming within reach of retaliation, had demonstrated that the range advantage was even greater than Throk had feared. "It is deep," Torg gasped, his good eye rolling with pain. "I can feel it against the bone." "Do not move," Throk commanded. He looked up at Mira, who had emerged at the commotion. "Get the healing herbs, the moss for bleeding. Quickly." As Mira rushed to comply, Throk returned his attention to the cliff face. The 3 climbers were still there, but they had stopped ascending. Instead, they were settling into their positions, arranging themselves for maximum tactical advantage. Each held an atlatl. Each had multiple spears. They were not going to storm the cave. They were going to bombard it, turn the entrance into a killing ground, where any defender who showed themselves would be skewered. Force the Neanderthals to choose between hiding uselessly or exposing themselves to projectile fire they had no defense against. "We cannot hold the entrance," Throk said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Not against those weapons, not at this range." "Then we fall back," Gran decided, "to the narrow passage. Let them take the main chamber if they wish. We will defend where their range means nothing and their numbers cannot overwhelm us." It was a bitter retreat, an abandonment of sacred space. The main chamber had been their home, their gathering place, the heart of their existence. The paintings on the walls represented thousands of years of habitation. The fire pit in the center had burned without cease for longer than memory. To give it up felt like giving up their identity itself. But identity meant nothing to the dead. "Everyone back," Throk ordered. "To the deep chamber, now. Mac, help Torg. Brock, Crag, Dern, grab the weapons and supplies. Anything we leave behind is lost forever." The males scrambled to comply, moving with the jerky haste of those who know death is breathing down their necks. Young Brock paused at the fire pit, where old Kira had tended the eternal flame for so many years. The coals were still glowing, still holding the heat that linked them to their ancestors. "The fire," Brock said helplessly. "Grandmother carried it to the deep chamber, but these coals—" "Leave them," Throk said, though the words cost him. "We cannot take everything." They retreated through the main chamber in an organized withdrawal that spoke to Gron's lifetime of tactical experience. The strongest males stayed at the rear, ready to fight any immediate pursuit. The wounded moved to the middle. The women and children were already secured in the deepest recess. As Throk took a final look at the main chamber before entering the narrow passage, he saw the first other appear at the cave entrance. The climber had made it to the top. He crouched at the opening, peering into the gloom with those strange, high-foreheaded features. For a moment, man and Neanderthal made eye contact across the smoky air. There was no hatred in the other's face, no anger, no passion whatsoever. He looked at Throk the way Throk might look at a mammoth that needed killing, with focus, with purpose, but without malice. It was not personal. It was simply necessary. The other raised his hand and made a gesture, a signal. More climbers were coming. The invasion had begun. Throk turned and squeezed through the narrow passage, following his people into the deep chamber where the bones of their ancestors lay in silent witness. Behind him, he heard the sound of feet on stone, multiple feet. The others had entered their home. The sun was now one hand width above the western mountains. 35 minutes had passed since the attack began. 25 minutes remained in the hour that would decide whether Homo neanderthalensis survived or vanished from the earth forever. In the main chamber they had just abandoned, the eternal flame flickered once, twice, then went out for the first time in millennia. The darkness that rushed in felt prophetic. The deep chamber, minutes 35 to 25. The narrow passage squeezed Throk's broad shoulders like a vice. Designed by nature rather than intent, the limestone corridor forced even the smallest adult to turn sideways and shuffle through its 10-pace length. For males of Throk's size, it was a claustrophobic nightmare that required controlled breathing and constant mental effort not to panic. But it was also the perfect choke point. No enemy could charge through this passage. No group could attack in concert. Anyone attempting to force through would come one at a time, off balance, vulnerable, and waiting on the other side would be Neanderthal males with spears, with clubs, with hands strong enough to crush a wolf's skull. In this passage, all the others' advantages evaporated. Numbers meant nothing. Range meant nothing. Only raw strength mattered. And in that calculation, Throk's people held absolute supremacy. "How many came through?" Gron asked as Throk emerged into the deep chamber. "I saw 3 enter the main chamber before we sealed this passage, but there will be more, many more by now." The deep chamber was larger than Throk remembered from the rare ceremonies that brought the living to this place. Perhaps 15 paces across and twice that in length, with a ceiling that soared into darkness beyond the reach of firelight. The walls were covered in paintings far older than those in the main chamber. Images of animals that no longer existed, hunters dressed in styles no living person recognized, symbols whose meanings had been lost generations ago. This was the sanctum of the ancestors, the original chamber from which all other passages had been carved or discovered over millennia. The bones of the dead lined the walls in careful arrangements, skulls watching with empty sockets as their descendants prepared for what might be their own final rest. The women had organized the space with impressive efficiency. Mira had positioned the children against the far wall, using bundles of furs to create a soft barrier. Old Kira had successfully transplanted her precious coals to a flat stone, and a small fire now burned in the center of the chamber, its smoke rising to find vents in the ceiling that had drawn air for thousands of years. Water bladders were stacked near the fire. Dried meat and other supplies formed a small mountain of sustenance. It was a fortress, a tomb, a final redoubt. "How long can we survive here?" Dura asked. She was attempting to clean and bind Torg's shoulder wound, though the injured hunter's face had gone gray, and his breathing had become labored. The spear had gone deep, possibly nicking lung or major vessels. Even with their people's legendary toughness, Torg's survival was uncertain. "We have water for 3 days if we ration carefully," Myra reported, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Food for longer, maybe 7 days. But the air—" She did not need to finish. The deep chamber had ventilation, but it was designed for periodic ceremonial use, not for 23 people living continuously in confined space. The fire alone consumed substantial air. Add the breathing of so many bodies, and the oxygen would gradually deplete. They could survive for days, perhaps, but not in comfort. Not without eventual suffocation if the siege lasted too long. "They will not wait days," Gran said, reading the tactical situation with his usual grim accuracy. "They know we are cornered. They will press their advantage while they have momentum, while we are still reeling from the first assault. I give them 1 hour at most before they attempt to force this passage." 1 hour. 60 minutes. The same amount of time that had passed since Throk first noticed the ominous silence. Time was moving with terrible speed now, each minute bringing them closer to the final confrontation. Young Brock and his brothers had taken up positions near the passage entrance, spears ready. Their young faces showed a mixture of fear and fierce determination. Beside them, Throk worked methodically, testing the weight and balance of each weapon, arranging stones for throwing, preparing for close combat in ways that his ancestors would have recognized across 300 millennia. "What are they doing out there?" Cragg asked. At 14 summers, he was the youngest of the fighting males, still growing into his full strength. His voice had only recently deepened, and he held his spear with a grip that was slightly too tight, the grip of someone trying to control fear through physical tension. "Exploring," Throk replied. "Learning the layout, finding our supplies, our tools, taking what is useful. They are in no rush. Why should they be? We cannot escape. We cannot counterattack. We can only wait while they decide how to finish us." It was a brutal assessment, but accuracy mattered more than comfort now. The young males needed to understand the reality of their situation. False hope would only make the eventual shock worse. From the main chamber beyond the passage, sounds filtered through. Footsteps. Multiple voices speaking in a language that sounded almost familiar, but was structured differently, with different rhythms and tones. The others were examining their conquest, marveling perhaps at the paintings, at the ancient fire pit, at the evidence of continuous habitation stretching back into unimaginable time. "Will they destroy the paintings?" Mira asked softly. She had been raised on stories of the great hunts depicted on those walls, had learned to read the visual language of her people's history before she could speak in full sentences. "I do not know," Throk admitted. "I do not understand them well enough to predict. Do they see what we see? Do they recognize art, history, meaning? Or do they see only stone and pigment?" In the main chamber, Kesh ran his fingers across the ochre paintings with something approaching reverence. He recognized the images: aurochs, mammoths, deer. The style was different from his people's art, less naturalistic, more symbolic. But the intent was clear. These were not animals. These were records, stories, memory made visible. His people had art too. They painted, they carved, they created. But they did not maintain sites like this, did not return generation after generation to the same caves, did not build their entire existence around fixed locations. They were nomadic by preference and necessity, following game and opportunity, never staying long enough to leave more than temporary marks on the landscape. The Neanderthals, by contrast, seemed rooted to their caves like trees to soil. They inherited homes from their ancestors and expected to pass them to descendants. They marked the walls with their presence, left their dead in sacred chambers, built continuity across time in ways Kesh's people rarely attempted. It made them predictable, vulnerable, easy to find and besiege. Their very stability was their weakness in a world where mobility meant survival. One of Kesh's warriors approached, a young male named Tren, who had proven himself clever in previous campaigns. "The main chamber is secured. No resistance. They have withdrawn to the back, through a narrow passage, too narrow for comfortable access." "How narrow?" Kesh asked. "One man at a time, maybe less. I could force through, but not easily, not quickly." Kesh nodded slowly. He had expected this. The Neanderthals were not stupid. They would choose defensive ground that negated his numerical advantage. They would make him pay in blood for every pace gained, and they would hope that the cost would become too high, that he would decide the cave was not worth the losses. But Kesh had not come this far, had not eliminated every other Neanderthal clan in the region to be deterred by a narrow passage and determined defenders. This was not about one cave. It was about the future, about which species would inherit this land, these hunting grounds, these resources, about whether his children and grandchildren would live in a world that still contained Neanderthals, with all the competition and conflict that implied. The answer to that question was worth any price. "Bring fire," Kesh ordered. "Lots of fire. And collect all the animal fat and oil you can find. We will smoke them out." It was a strategy as old as hunting itself. Cave bears could be driven from their dens with smoke. So could any animal that breathed. The Neanderthals were tough, yes, stronger than any Homo Sapiens. But they still needed air, still needed oxygen. And smoke was patient. Smoke was thorough. Smoke would fill every crevice, every passage, every pocket of the cave system, until the choice became simple: emerge or suffocate. In the deep chamber, Gron's head suddenly lifted. His scarred nostrils flared, testing the air. "Do you smell that?" Throk inhaled deeply and felt his heart sink. Smoke. Not the clean smoke of their own small fire, but something heavier, greasier. The smoke of materials burning that were not meant to burn. "They are smoking us," Throk said. his voice flat with the certainty of defeat. The old bear hunting trick. But we are the bears now. Myra clutched Cale tighter, her daughter's red hair bright against the dimness. Around them, the other women pulled children close, their faces showing the terrible understanding that all options were narrowing to none. The children sensed their mother's fear and began to cry, their wails echoing off stone walls painted by people who never imagined this ending. "Block the passage," Throk commanded. "Use furs, use hides, anything. Create a seal. Maybe we can keep most of the smoke out." The males rushed to comply, stuffing the passage with leather and fur, packing it tight. But even as they worked, Throk knew it was a temporary measure at best. The cave system was interconnected through cracks and fissures too small to see, but large enough for air and smoke to travel. There was no perfect seal, no absolute protection. They could slow the smoke's advance. They could buy minutes, maybe an hour. But eventually, the deep chamber would fill. And then they would face the same choice every cave bear had faced when hunters burned them out. Emerge into waiting spears or die in the darkness. "There must be another way," young Brock insisted, his voice cracked with desperation. "A back exit, a passage to the surface, something." Gron shook his head wearily. "I have known this cave for 58 summers. My father knew it for 60 before me. His father for 57 before him. If there was another exit, we would know it. We are familiar with every handspan of stone from the entrance to the deepest recess. There is no escape." "Then we fight," Brock said. "We wait until the smoke forces us out, and then we charge. We die like hunters, not trapped animals." It was the courage of youth speaking, magnificent and futile. Throk looked at the young male with a mixture of pride and grief. Yes, they could charge. They could burst through the passage one at a time, weapons swinging, and kill perhaps 3 or 4 of the others before being overwhelmed. It would be a death worthy of songs, if anyone survived to sing them. But it would also be the end. The absolute end. Every male would die in that suicidal charge, and then the women and children would be at the others' mercy. Throk did not know if they would be killed or enslaved or adopted. He had no framework for understanding what happened when one human species conquered another, because it had never happened before in all of history. The smoke was thickening now, despite the blocked passage. Tendrils of it curled along the ceiling, seeking the ventilation shafts, filling them, backing up, accumulating. The children's crying had become coughing. Old Kara's song of protection had devolved into wheezing gasps. Even the fire at the chamber's center was struggling, its flames stuttering as oxygen levels dropped. Torg, wounded and weakening, looked up at Throk with his one good eye. "Let me go first," he rasped. "I am already dying. My charge might give the others advantage." "No one is charging yet," Throk said firmly. But even as he spoke, he was calculating how long until the smoke became unbearable. 20 minutes? 30? And what would he do when that moment arrived? He looked at Mira, at Cale in her arms. His daughter's face was streaked with soot and tears. She was coughing, her small body convulsing with each spasm. 3 summers old. She should have had a lifetime ahead of her. Should have grown strong and fierce like her mother. Should have had children of her own, passing the lineage forward into an infinite future. Instead, she would die in this chamber, surrounded by the bones of ancestors who never imagined their line would end, who never conceived that the world could change so completely that there would no longer be room for their kind. From beyond the blocked passage, sounds of activity. Wood cracking, materials being piled and arranged. The others were building their fire methodically, feeding it with everything that would burn. They were using the Neanderthals' own supplies as fuel for their destruction. Dried meat for fat content, wooden tools for tinder, leather goods for thick black smoke. It was efficient, ruthless, and devastatingly effective. "Throk," Mira said quietly. She had moved close to him, still holding Kale. Her eyes held a question that she did not want to voice, but needed answered. "If we surrender, if we emerge peacefully, would they let the children live?" It was the question every mother in that chamber wanted to ask. The men could die fighting. That was honorable, expected, even necessary. But the children, surely even the others would spare children. Throk wanted desperately to say yes, wanted to promise that mercy existed, that there was a path forward that did not end in total annihilation. But he remembered the other's face at the cave entrance, the cold assessment, the complete absence of sentiment or doubt. "I do not know," he said honestly. "Our peoples have coexisted for how long? Thousands of generations? But we have rarely shared space peacefully. When 2 hunting parties meet, one retreats or both fight. There is no middle ground, no integration. We are too different and too similar at once." It was the central tragedy of their situation. They were different species, yes, but not so different that peaceful coexistence was impossible in theory. They could speak after a fashion, could recognize each other as intelligent, tool-using hunters, could potentially share territories and resources, but they did not, could not, would not. Because at some fundamental level, both species knew the world was not big enough for both, knew that every cave one held was a cave the other could not have. Every hunting ground one claimed was protein denied to the other. In a world of limited resources and expanding populations, tolerance was a luxury neither could afford. The smoke was now thick enough to see, gray clouds roiling along the ceiling and beginning their inevitable descent. The children's coughing had become constant, punctuated by crying and calls for water. The women had soaked cloths and were pressing them over small faces, trying to filter the air, buying minutes at the cost of comfort. Gran coughed violently, his aged lungs less able to handle the contamination. When he caught his breath, he looked at his son with eyes that held both love and infinite sadness. "This is how it ends, then. Not in glorious battle, not in failed hunt or winter starvation, but in smoke and darkness, driven from our home like foxes from a den." "It has not ended yet," Throk said, though the words rang hollow even to his own ears. "No, but it will, soon." Gran placed a hand on Throk's shoulder. "You were a good son, a strong hunter, a wise leader when circumstances gave you no wisdom to work with. You did everything right, and it still was not enough. Remember that when the end comes. You bear no blame for what happens here. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like eulogy. Gran was already treating their deaths as accomplished facts, offering absolution for failures that were not failures at all, but simply the inevitable mathematics of extinction. The sun had now touched the western mountains. In the valley outside, evening birds should have been singing their territorial songs. Deer should have been emerging from the forest to graze in the cooling air. Life should have been continuing its eternal patterns. Instead, there was only smoke and silence, and the patient certainty of enemies who had already won. 25 minutes had passed since the others entered the main chamber. 15 minutes remained in the hour that had always been too short. The 60 minutes that were never enough for anything except the documentation of ending. Throk looked around the deep chamber one final time. At his father, old and wise and dying. At Throk and the young males, strong and brave and doomed. At Mira and Kale and the other women and children who represented every hope for continuation that would never be fulfilled. At old Kira, still trying to tend her fire even as smoke stole her breath. At the ancient paintings on the walls, the bones of the ancestors, the accumulated evidence of 300,000 years of existence. All of it ending, here, now, in this chamber, in this hour. He tightened his grip on his spear and waited for the smoke to make his decision for him. The impossible choice. Minutes 25 to 15. Kale stopped coughing and went limp in Mira's arms. For one heart-stopping moment, Throk thought his daughter had died. Then he saw her small chest still rising and falling, shallow but steady. She had not died. She had lost consciousness, her 3-year-old body unable to sustain the effort of breathing poisoned air any longer. It was, in its own terrible way, a mercy. She would no longer feel the burning in her lungs, the panic of suffocation, the fear that radiated from every adult in the chamber. But it was also a countdown.
"She is still breathing," Myra whispered, her voice breaking. "But for how long? How long before the smoke takes her completely?"
Around the chamber, 2 other children had also slipped into unconsciousness. The smallest ones went first, their tiny lungs unable to filter enough oxygen from the increasingly toxic air. The older children still coughed and cried, but their sounds had become weaker, more desperate. Even the adults were struggling now, every breath a labored effort that brought more smoke than air. "We have to do something," Dura pleaded, looking at Throk with eyes that demanded leadership even when no good choices remained. "We cannot just sit here and watch them die." Throk looked to his father. Gran sat against the wall, his chest heaving with the effort of breathing, but his eyes remained clear and focused. The old hunter met his son's gaze and slowly shook his head, not in negation, but in acknowledgement of reality. There was nothing to do. No clever strategy remained, no hidden advantage to exploit. They had been outmaneuvered, outthought, and now they were being methodically eliminated without the others having to risk a single warrior in close combat. "We emerge," Rock said suddenly. His voice was thick with smoke and emotion. "We go out fighting. Not all of us, just the males. The strongest. We charge through that passage, and we kill as many as we can before they bring us down. And while they are occupied with us, the women take the children and run. Out the cave entrance, down the cliff. Maybe some will make it, maybe not. But it is a chance. It is more than waiting here for death. It was the kind of straightforward, courageous, ultimately futile plan that Neanderthal males had been executing for 300,000 years. Simple, direct, relying on strength and sacrifice. And in any previous era, against any previous enemy, it might even have worked, but not against the others.
"They will have warriors at the passage exit," Gron said wearily, "waiting with those spear throwers of theirs. You will emerge one at a time, already gasping for air, and they will kill you before you take 3 steps. And then they will kill the women and children who follow. They are not stupid. They know exactly what we will try, because it is what they would try. They have planned for it."
"Then what?" Throk demanded, his voice rising with frustration. "What do you propose, old one? That we sit here and suffocate? That we die without even attempting to fight?"
"I propose that we face the truth," Gron said quietly. "We have lost. Our people have lost. This cave, this clan, this line, it ends here. The only choice remaining is how it ends, with dignity or with panic, with acceptance or with denial." The words fell into the smoky chamber like stones into deep water. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sounds were coughing, the crackle of their dying fire, and from beyond the blocked passage, the steady roar of the other's blaze consuming everything the Neanderthals owned. Young Brock suddenly stood, his young face twisted with rage and despair. "No, I refuse. I refuse to accept this. We are hunters. We are strong. My grandfather killed a cave lion with his bare hands. My father once brought down a mammoth with a single spear throw. I am descended from the greatest hunters who ever lived, and I will not die cowering in the dark like a frightened rabbit." He grabbed his spear and moved toward the blocked passage, clearly intending to tear away the makeshift seal and charge through alone. It was suicide, brave, magnificent, and utterly pointless suicide. But before he could reach the passage, Throk's hand clamped down on his shoulder with crushing force. "Stop," Throk commanded. His voice carried absolute authority now, the voice of a leader who had moved beyond hope into something harder and clearer. "You will not throw your life away on a gesture. If we die with purpose. We die protecting something. We die for a reason." "What reason?" Brock shouted, tears cutting tracks through the soot on his face. "What purpose is there in waiting to suffocate? What are we protecting by sitting here?" Throk looked at the unconscious children, at Mira cradling Kale's limp body, at old Kara who had collapsed near her fire and might already be dead. "We are protecting their last moments. We are protecting them from seeing their fathers cut down like animals. We are protecting them from the terror of watching us fail. If they must die, let them die in unconsciousness, peacefully, surrounded by family, not in violence and screaming and blood." It was not the warrior's answer. It was not the response that countless generations of Neanderthal males would have given. But Throk had been changed by his encounters with the others, had been forced to think in ways his ancestors never had to. And he understood, with terrible clarity, that sometimes protection meant acceptance. Sometimes love meant choosing the manner of death. Brock's rage collapsed into grief. He sank to his knees, his spear clattering to the stone floor, and wept. His brothers moved to comfort him, their own faces streaming with tears and soot. Around the chamber, the other males were also beginning to understand, beginning to accept, beginning to make peace with the ending that could no longer be avoided. But Mira was not ready to surrender. "There must be something," she insisted, her voice fierce despite her obvious weakness. She had positioned herself near the small fire, using its updraft to pull slightly cleaner air down to Cale's level. "Some action we have not considered, some possibility we have overlooked. People like us do not simply end. We have survived ice ages. We have survived famines. We have survived for longer than memory. We do not just stop." Throk moved to kneel beside his mate, placing one massive hand gently on Cale's forehead. Her skin was too hot, feverish from smoke inhalation. But she was alive. Still alive. For now. "Everything stops eventually," he said softly. "The great mammoths that once covered the plains. Where are they now? Few remain. The giant cave bears that our ancestors painted on these walls. Gone. The saber-toothed cats that hunted in packs. Vanished. The world changes, Mira, and sometimes the change leaves no room for those who came before." "But we are not animals," Mira protested. "We think. We plan. We adapt. We are—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought, because the truth was that they were exactly like the mammoths and the cave bears and all the other great beasts that had dominated their eras before disappearing into extinction. Intelligence had not saved those creatures. Strength had not preserved them, and it would not save the Neanderthals either. In the main chamber beyond the blocked passage, Kesh watched the smoke pour through every crack and crevice, filling the cave system with toxic certainty. Some of his warriors had asked if they should force the passage now, take advantage of the defenders' weakness to overwhelm them with numbers. But Kesh had refused. Why risk lives when smoke would finish the work at no cost? Why engage in close combat with desperate Neanderthals who might kill 3 or 4 warriors before being brought down? Patience had brought him this far. Patience would complete the victory. Besides, he was not entirely without feeling. He had seen the paintings, had recognized the evidence of long habitation, had understood, in his own way, that he was ending something ancient and significant. The Neanderthals were not animals to him. They were people. Strange people, primitive people, but people nonetheless. And ending people, even enemy people, deserved to be done thoroughly, but not cruelly. Smoke was cruel, yes, but it was less cruel than the alternative. Less cruel than storming the deep chamber and butchering terrified mothers holding their children. Less cruel than the hand-to-hand carnage that would result from forcing the narrow passage. This way, they would simply fall asleep, would slip from consciousness into death, without violence, without terror, without the sight of their killers' faces. It was mercy of a sort, the only mercy that Kesh could afford to offer. "How much longer?" Trin asked, standing beside his leader. "An hour," Kesh estimated. "Maybe less. The smoke is very thick now. They will lose consciousness soon if they have not already. And then it is simply a matter of waiting for their breathing to stop. And then? Then we clear the cave. We take what is useful. We leave the bodies where they lie. They have a burial chamber. Let it become their tomb. We close the entrance with rocks, and we move on to the next valley, the next territory, the next cave that might shelter any others of their kind." "You think there are more?" Kesh was quiet for a moment, considering. "Perhaps. In the far mountains, in isolated valleys we have not yet explored. But not many. We have cleared this entire region over the past 5 years. This was the last clan we knew of. If others remain, they are scattered, isolated, cut off from each other. They will die out naturally within a generation or two.
even if we never find them. It was not genocide, Kesh told himself. It was simply inevitability. His people needed space to expand, needed hunting grounds to feed their growing populations. And the Neanderthals, for all their strength and toughness, could not adapt quickly enough, could not cooperate in large enough groups, could not sustain the kind of coordinated warfare that the situation demanded. They were magnificent hunters. They were excellent survivors in harsh conditions, but they were not warriors. Not really. And in a world where warfare determined territory and territory determined survival, that made all the difference. In the deep chamber, the smoke had reached the floor level. There was no clean air left anywhere. Every breath was poison. Every inhalation burned. Throk could feel his consciousness beginning to waver, his vision darkening at the edges. Around him, the others were succumbing. Throk had slumped against a wall, still clutching his spear but no longer fully aware. The young males were sprawled on the floor, their chests rising and falling in increasingly shallow breaths. Even Gron, tough old Gron who had survived everything the world threw at him for 58 years, was fading. His eyes were closed, his breathing barely perceptible. But as Throk watched, the old hunter's eyes fluttered open one last time. Father and son made eye contact across the dying firelight. Gron's lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear over the roar of blood in Throk's ears. But Throk could read them anyway. "You did well." Then Gron's eyes closed, and he was gone. Not dead, not yet, but unconscious and sliding toward the final darkness. Throk felt something break inside his chest, some last reservoir of hope or denial or resistance. His father had been his anchor, his guide, his model for how to be a male and a hunter and a leader. And now he was watching that anchor sink into death. Mira's hand found his, gripping with desperate strength. She had laid Kale down beside her, the child's body so still that Throk could not tell if she still breathed. Mira's eyes met his, and in them he saw everything they had shared. The first mating ceremony, the joy when Kale was born, the countless hunts and meals and quiet moments by the fire, a lifetime compressed into a single look. "I am sorry," Throk whispered, though he was not sure what he was apologizing for failing to protect her, for bringing her to this ending, for not being clever enough or strong enough or adaptable enough to save their daughter. "You have nothing to be sorry for," Mira replied, her voice barely audible. "You were the best mate I could have asked for, the best father Kale could have known. This is not your failure. This is simply the world changing, and we could not change with it fast enough." It was absolution, forgiveness, and farewell all at once. Throk wanted to respond, wanted to tell her how much he loved her, how he would have done anything to give her a different ending. But his lungs would not cooperate. The smoke had stolen his voice, his strength, his future. He collapsed beside Mira and Kale, one hand on his mate, one hand on his daughter. Around him, the deep chamber had gone quiet, except for the crackle of the dying fire. No more coughing, no more crying, no more sounds of struggle. Just silence settling over the last Neanderthals like a shroud. 15 minutes remained in the hour, but for all practical purposes, the hour was already over. The 60 minutes had run out. The last cave had fallen. The final chapter was being written in smoke and suffocation and the terrible quiet of extinction. On the walls,
the ancient paintings watched in silence. The mammoths and aurochs and hunting scenes bore witness to an ending that would leave no witnesses. In 40,000 years, archaeologists would find this chamber, would carbon date the ash layer, would note the abrupt cessation of habitation. They would theorize about what happened, would debate and speculate and write papers. But they would never know the truth, would never know about Throk's courage, or Gron's wisdom, or Mira's love, would never know about young Brock's rage, or old Kira's songs, or little Kale's red hair that would leave no descendants. The Neanderthals would become statistics, evolutionary footnotes, specimens in museums. Their deaths would be clinical.
Documented, analyzed, but never truly understood.
Throk's eyes closed for the last time. His massive chest rose once, twice, struggling against the smoke, and then was still. The eternal silence, minutes 15 to 5. But Throk did not die, not in that moment, not yet, because even as his consciousness spiraled toward darkness, some ancient survival mechanism deeper than thought forced his body to take one more breath, and another, and another. His Neanderthal physiology evolved over 300,000 years to survive in the harshest conditions Earth could conjure, refused to surrender quietly. His barrel chest, his massive lung capacity, his blood optimized to extract oxygen from thin mountain air, all of it fought against the smoke with stubborn, meaningless persistence. He became aware of the stone floor beneath him, cold, unyielding, real. He was still alive, though he could not understand why or for how long. His eyes would not open, his limbs would not respond, but his mind flickered with terrible awareness, trapped in a body that had become a prison. Around him in the darkness, behind his closed eyelids, he could sense rather than see the stillness of the others. Mira's hand had gone slack in his. Kale's small body no longer radiated the feverish heat of struggle. The silence was complete, absolute, the silence of a tomb that had claimed its final occupants. How long had he been unconscious? Minutes? Hours? Time had lost all meaning in the smoke-filled darkness. But gradually, through the roaring in his ears, Throk became aware of new sounds, movement, footsteps, voices speaking in that almost familiar language of the others. They had entered the deep chamber. Throk's mind screamed at his body to move, to fight, to do something. But his muscles remained frozen, starved of oxygen, unresponsive as stone. He could only lie there as the footsteps grew closer, as light from torches painted patterns against his closed eyelids, as the voices of his enemies discussed his corpse in tones that suggested neither triumph nor cruelty, only efficient assessment. "This one is the largest," a voice said in that strange tongue. The words were just different enough from Throk's language that he understood perhaps one word in 3, but the meaning was clear enough. "Look at the size of him, like a bear standing upright." "They are all dead?" Another voice, younger. "Appears so. Check them all. Make certain." Footsteps moved through the chamber, pausing at each fallen body. Throk heard the sounds of the others examining his people, touching them, confirming death. He waited for hands to reach him, to check for breath or pulse, and wondered if he had enough consciousness left to attack, if his paralyzed limbs would obey one final command to kill even one of these invaders before his own death. But when the hands came, surprisingly gentle, they merely touched his neck, felt for the blood pulse there, then moved on. This one too, the whole clan gone. The children? The younger voice again, carrying a note that might have been regret. All of them. There was no other way. They would not surrender. They would not leave. And we cannot share this territory with them. You know this, Trin. You have known it since we began this campaign. Trin. Throk recognized the name from earlier, one of the warriors who had climbed the cliff face. And the other voice, Kesh, the leader, the architect of this extinction. Through his partially functioning hearing, Throk tracked their movements around the chamber. They were examining the walls now, the ancient paintings that told stories in ochre and charcoal and mineral pigments. Stories of hunts that would never happen again, of a people who would never paint again. Remarkable, Kesh said, and there was genuine wonder in his voice. Look at this. This painting must be, I cannot even guess how old. See how the style is different from the ones in the main chamber? Older, much older. This cave has been inhabited for an impossible amount of time. And now it ends, Trin observed. Yes, now it ends. A pause. Cover the bodies, all of them. Use their own furs. Let them lie here with their ancestors. This place is their tomb now. Let it remain sacred. It was unexpected mercy from an enemy who had shown none in the assault. But perhaps that was the point. The killing could be ruthless, but the aftermath could honor the dead, could acknowledge that something significant had ended here, that these were not animals but people, strange and different, but people nonetheless. Throk felt a fur being draped over his body, felt the weight of it settling across his chest, his face, blocking what little light penetrated his closed eyelids. He was being buried alive, and there was nothing he could do about it. His body remained utterly unresponsive, his consciousness a prisoner screaming silently in a shell of dead flesh. Or nearly dead flesh. Because as the minutes passed and the others worked, Throk became aware of a gradual change. The cleaner air that had entered with the others was being drawn into his lungs. His blood was slowly, incrementally, beginning to carry oxygen again. Sensation was returning to his extremities, pins and needles, then burning pain, then vague awareness of position and pressure. He was recovering. Impossibly, incredibly, he was recovering from what should have been fatal smoke inhalation. His body's legendary toughness was pulling him back from the very edge of death. But what was he recovering to? The others were still in the chamber, still moving around, still speaking. If he showed any sign of consciousness, they would kill him immediately. His only chance, his only possible chance, was to remain perfectly still. To fake death so convincingly that they would leave. And then what? Escape? To where? Fight? Against how many? Survive? For what purpose? The questions had no answers. But some deep instinct that had kept his species alive for 300,000 years overrode logic and despair. Survive first. Find purpose later. It was the fundamental algorithm of life itself. Should we take anything? Trin asked. Their tools, their weapons? Some are well made. Take nothing, Kesh commanded. This is their tomb. Let them keep what was theirs. We have our own tools, our own ways. We do not need relics from the dead to prosper. More footsteps, more movement. Throk tracked it all through sound alone, building a mental map of the chamber. Kesh and Tren were near the entrance passage. Two other voices indicated at least two more warriors, probably positioned near the paintings. 4 enemies, possibly more in the main chamber beyond. Throk's right hand, hidden beneath the fur covering him, clenched slightly. Testing. The fingers responded. Weak, trembling, but responding. His legs remained numb, useless. His chest felt like it was being crushed by a mammoth. But his arms, his massive, powerful arms, were beginning to wake up. "What about the fire?" one of the other warriors asked. "Should we maintain it? Some of our people believe the dead need light to find their way to the next world." "Our people, yes," Kesh replied. "But these are not our people. I do not know what they believed about death, what ceremonies they practiced. Better to let their own fire die naturally than to impose our customs on their rest." It was a small gesture of respect, but Throk heard it for what it was. Acknowledgement of difference. Kesh understood, at least intellectually, that the Neanderthals had their own beliefs, their own ways, their own validity as thinking beings. He had killed them anyway. But he had killed them as rivals, not as animals. There was a distinction there, subtle but real. The footsteps were moving toward the passage now. The others were preparing to leave. Throk's heart, his massive, powerful heart that had pumped blood through his body for 37 years, began to beat faster. This was the moment. They would either discover he lived, or they would leave. Life or death, decided in the next few heartbeats. "Seal the passage," Kesh ordered. "Use stones from the main chamber. Block it completely. No scavengers should disturb this place." "How thick?" Tren asked. "Thick enough that it would take days to dig through. This chamber should remain undisturbed until the end of time." The implications crashed over Throk like an avalanche. They were going to seal him in. Seal him in alive with the dead bodies of everyone he had ever loved. Even if he survived the smoke, even if he regained full mobility, he would be trapped in this chamber forever, would die slowly of thirst and starvation in the darkness, surrounded by his family's corpses. It was a fate worse than death in battle, worse than being cut down in a suicidal charge. To survive only to be buried alive, it was the cruelest joke the spirits could play. But still, that deep survival instinct kept him frozen, kept him silent, because revealing himself now meant certain death, while staying hidden meant, what? A few more days of life? The theoretical possibility of escape? It was irrational, but rationality had abandoned him along with hope. The sounds of stones being moved echoed through the passage. Heavy scraping, grunting effort. The others were building their wall methodically, stone by stone, sealing the deep chamber off from the world, sealing the last Neanderthals into their final rest. "This feels wrong," Tren said quietly as they worked. "Like we are erasing something important, something that should be remembered." "It will be remembered," Kesh replied. "We will remember. We will tell our children that we found this place, that the old ones lived here, that they were strong and brave, and they fought to the last breath. We will not forget them, Tren. But neither can we share the world with them. The choice was made long ago by forces larger than any of us. We are simply completing what was always inevitable." It was philosophy, justification, and eulogy combined. Kesh was a warrior, yes, but also something more. A leader who understood the weight of what he had done, who knew that he was not just winning a battle, but ending a species, and who needed to construct meaning around that act to make it bearable. The scraping continued. The wall grew, and Throk lay perfectly still beneath his fur covering, his mind churning with calculations that all led nowhere. Even if the others left, Even if he somehow recovered enough strength to move, the wall would trap him. Even his legendary strength could not dig through several hands' width of packed stone without tools, without time, without help. He was already dead. The smoke had simply been too slow to finish the job. From the main chamber, another voice called out, "Kesh! The sun is setting. We should make camp before full dark. The others will want to hear about the victory." "Coming," Kesh replied. He paused, and Throk heard him take a deep breath. "Cover the passage entrance from the main chamber side as well. Make it clear that this space is not to be entered. This is sacred ground now." "Understood." The footsteps retreated. The voices faded, and slowly, gradually, Throk became aware that the deep chamber had gone silent again. Utterly silent. The others had left. They had sealed their wall and departed to celebrate their victory, leaving him alone with the dead. Throk waited, counting heartbeats in the darkness. 100, 200, 500, making certain they were truly gone, that this was not a trick or a test. And with each heartbeat, his body continued its miraculous recovery. Feeling returned to his legs. Strength flowed back into his arms. His breathing, while still labored, was clearing. He was alive. Impossibly, he was alive when everyone he had ever known was dead. At last, moving with infinite care, Throk pushed the fur away from his face. His eyes opened to near total darkness. The eternal flame had finally died, leaving only the faint glow of embers. In that dim light, he could make out the shapes around him. Mira, Kale, his father, Rock and his sons, old Kira, Dura and her children, all of them lying still beneath furs that had become shrouds, all of them gone to whatever place the dead went, leaving him behind. Throk tried to sit up and nearly blacked out from the effort. His body was not ready for movement yet, no matter what his mind demanded. But he forced himself through the dizziness, through the pain, through the crushing weight of grief that threatened to pull him back into unconsciousness. He crawled to Mira first, removed the fur covering her, pressed his ear to her chest, listening desperately for a heartbeat he knew would not be there. Nothing. She was gone. Had been gone for some time, her body already cooling in the subterranean air. He checked Kale next, though he knew. Had known from the moment he regained consciousness and felt her small body still and silent beside him. His daughter, his bright, beautiful daughter with her mother's red hair, would never grow up, would never hunt, would never have children of her own. Her line ended here, in this chamber, age 3. One by one, Throk checked the others. His father Gron, dead. Young Brock and his brothers, dead. All the males who should have grown old and wise, all the children who should have become the next generation, all the women who should have birthed the future, all dead. Only Throk remained, the last Neanderthal in this cave, possibly the last Neanderthal anywhere in this entire region, a species reduced to a single consciousness trapped in a sealed tomb. He dragged himself to the blocked passage and examined it in the dim ember light. The wall was solid, professional work. The others knew what they were doing. He could try to dig through, but it would take days without proper tools, and even if he succeeded, he would emerge into the main chamber where the others might still be camping, where they would kill him on sight. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps death in the attempt was better than slow starvation in the dark. At least it would be action. At least it would be defiance. Throk placed his hands against the stone wall and pushed, testing. His muscles, still weak from smoke inhalation, trembled with effort, but moved the stones not at all. He would need time to recover, need food and water to rebuild his strength. His thoughts trailed off as a terrible realization struck him. The water bladders were in the deep chamber. The others had left them. The dried meat, too. He had supplies. He could survive for days, maybe weeks in this tomb. Could recover his full strength. Could dig through the wall with the patience of the desperate. He could survive. But for what? To emerge into a world owned by the others? To spend the rest of his life hiding, running, watching for enemies? To live as the last of his kind, with no mate, no clan, no future, no hope of continuation. What was the point of survival if survival meant nothing? 5 minutes remained in the hour. Outside, the sun had set completely. Stars were emerging in a sky that would look down on a world forever changed. A world where one less species drew breath. Where 300,000 years of existence had been snuffed out in a single afternoon. Throk sat in the darkness with the dead and wondered if he should bother trying to dig through the wall at all. The final 5. Minutes 5 to 0. Throk sat in the darkness for a time he could not measure, his back against the cold stone wall, his hands resting limply on his knees. The embers of old Kara's fire had finally gone completely cold. The eternal flame that had burned for millennia had become ash and memory. The darkness was now absolute, total. The kind of darkness that existed before the world was made. In that darkness, Throk's mind began to do something it had never done before. It began to remember not just recent events, but deep time. Memories surfaced that were not quite his own. Genetic echoes, perhaps, or simply the accumulated weight of being the last of a line stretching back into unimaginable antiquity. He remembered, or thought he remembered, ice. Vast sheets of it covering the world, grinding mountains into dust, forcing his ancestors into narrow refuges along the southern coasts. He remembered the warmth that followed, the explosion of game, the golden age when Neanderthals ranged across entire continents and feared nothing. He remembered the slow changes, so gradual that no single generation noticed, as the world shifted around them in ways they could not adapt to quickly enough. He remembered, though he had never been taught this, that his people had once been numerous, hundreds of thousands perhaps, spread across territories so vast that a runner could travel for months without reaching the edge of Neanderthal lands. When had that changed? When had the contraction begun? When had the others started appearing in numbers that mattered? His grandfather's grandfather might have known, but that knowledge had died with the elders, as all knowledge died with each generation of his people. They had no writing, no way to preserve wisdom across centuries. Each clan knew its own history, its own territory, its own techniques. But the larger pattern, the continental view of their species' decline, was invisible to them. They saw only the immediate. This valley emptying of game, that clan going silent, these others appearing in ever greater numbers. They had never understood they were losing a war, because they had never understood there was a war to lose. Throk's hands clenched into fists. Rage was building in him now, a fury so pure and absolute that it burned away the despair like morning sun burning fog. The others had won, yes, had killed his family, his clan, his people, had sealed him in this tomb with the dead, but they had made one crucial error. They had left him alive. He rose to his feet, swaying slightly as blood rushed from his head. His body was still weak, still recovering, but it was his body, the body of a Neanderthal male in his prime, the body of an apex predator that had dominated Europe for 300,000 years. The body of something that could break a wolf's spine with bare hands, that could hunt in blizzards that would kill the others in hours, that could survive injuries that would be instantly fatal to those thin, gracile invaders.
They should have checked more carefully, should have made certain every defender was truly dead. But they had assumed, as the others always assumed, that what worked for them must work for everyone. That smoke sufficient to kill Homo sapiens would equally kill Homo neanderthalensis. They had been wrong. Throk moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who had lived his entire life in caves. His hands found the water bladders by memory and spatial awareness. He drank deeply, feeling the cool liquid soothe his smoke-ravaged throat. Then he found the dried meat and ate, forcing his body to accept fuel even though grief had killed all appetite. He would need strength for what came next. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing the bodies of his family, he could not see them in the darkness, but he knew exactly where each lay. Throk made his way to the blocked passage. His hands explored the wall the others had built, learning its construction through touch alone. They had done good work, professional work. The stones were tightly fitted, carefully chosen for size and shape, wedged together in ways that created structural integrity. But they were still just stones, and Throk was still Neanderthal. He selected a stone near the top of the wall, one that seemed slightly smaller than the others, and began to work it loose. His fingers, proportionally shorter and thicker than Homo sapiens' fingers, had evolved for this exact kind of task, for gripping stones and bone and antler with crushing force. The stone resisted, held firm by the weight of those around it and the careful construction of the wall. Throk pulled harder. The muscles in his forearms, muscles that were proportionally larger and more powerful than any human who would live for the next 40,000 years, bulged with effort. Something in the wall shifted, a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but real. He had found the weakness. For the next period, it might have been an hour, might have been 3, Throk worked in the darkness with methodical patience. He was not trying to demolish the wall quickly. Quick demolition would create noise, would alert any others who might still be in the main chamber. Instead, he was carefully, quietly, stone by stone, creating a gap. A hole just large enough for him to squeeze through. It was delicate work that required all his considerable strength combined with surprising finesse. Remove a stone too quickly, and the others might shift, might collapse inward with a crash that would bring enemies running. Apply force too directly, and the stone might shatter, creating sharp sounds that would echo through the cave system. But Throk had spent his entire life working stone, knapping flint, shaping tools, building hunting blinds. His hands knew stone the way a bird knows air. And now, in the absolute darkness of his tomb, those hands performed their finest work. The first stone came free. Throk set it down carefully, soundlessly. Then the second, the third. With each stone removed, the structural integrity of the wall weakened slightly. With each stone removed, the gap widened. With each stone removed, the possibility of escape transformed from theoretical to real. Time became meaningless. There was only the work, only the stone and the darkness and the methodical destruction of his prison. Throk's mind entered a state that hunters knew well, the focused trance where thought ceased and instinct took over, where the body moved with unconscious perfection and time seemed to stop. He did not think about what he would do if others were waiting on the far side, did not plan his next moves beyond the immediate necessity of removing the next stone, did not consider the larger futility of escaping one tomb only to find himself trapped in a world that had no place for him. There was only the stone, only the work, only the next breath and the next movement and the gradual, incremental progress towards something that might be freedom or might be simply a different death. And then, suddenly, his hands found empty space. The gap was large enough, barely, but large enough for him to squeeze through if he turned sideways, if he compressed his massive frame, if he moved with the kind of contorted flexibility that his body was not really designed for, but could achieve through sheer determination. Throk paused. This was the moment. Once he went through that gap, there was no return. The deep chamber would remain behind him forever, sealed with his family's bodies, unreachable. If he was going to say goodbye, truly goodbye, it had to be now. He turned back to the darkness that held everyone he had ever loved. His voice, unused for hours, came out as a cracked whisper. Mira, Kale, Father, all of you. He paused, searching for words adequate to the moment and finding none. I do not know if you can hear me. I do not know if the dead listen to the living. But I will not let what happened here be meaningless. I will not let your deaths be forgotten. Somehow, some way, I will make the others remember, will make them understand what they destroyed. It was a promise made in darkness to the unhearing dead, a vow that might be impossible to keep, but it was all he had to offer. Throk turned back to the gap and began to squeeze through. His shoulders barely fit, his chest compressed painfully against the stones. For a terrible moment, he thought he might become stuck, trapped halfway between the tomb of the past and whatever waited in the future. But he forced himself through with raw strength, feeling skin tear, feeling blood begin to flow from a dozen scrapes and cuts. And then he was through. Standing in the narrow passage between the deep chamber and the main chamber, free of the tomb, but not yet free of the cave. Throk moved forward cautiously, one hand trailing along the wall for guidance in the darkness. The passage opened into the main chamber, and there, faint but real, he could see light. Not much, just the dim glow of a fire burning low. But it was enough to navigate by, enough to paint the chamber in shades of black and dark gray. The main chamber was empty. The others had left, presumably to camp outside or in the valley below. They had taken most of the Neanderthals' supplies, but had left the space itself intact. Throk could see his people's paintings on the walls, the ancient images of hunts and animals illuminated by the dying fire. The fire pit in the center still held hot coals. The others had maintained a small fire, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for light, perhaps simply because fire was sacred to them, as it was to all humans. Throk moved to the cave entrance and looked out at the night. The moon was rising, nearly full, painting the valley in silver light. He could see the others' camp below, a cluster of fires near the river, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals visible in the firelight. They were celebrating, he realized, singing songs in their strange language, passing food and drink, marking their victory with ritual and camaraderie. They thought the battle was over, thought all the Neanderthals were dead, thought they could relax their guard and celebrate safely. They were wrong. Throk looked down at his hands, massive, powerful, capable of incredible violence. He looked at the spears the others had left leaning against the cave wall, thinking them unnecessary now that all defenders were dead. He looked at the cliff face descending to the valley, at the route the others had used to climb up. He could go down there, could kill perhaps 5 or 6 before they overwhelmed him with numbers, could make them pay for what they had done, could die like a warrior instead of like a prisoner trapped in the dark. It would be glorious. Brief, futile, but glorious. But then what? Then he would be dead,
and the others would continue on, spreading across the land, eliminating any remaining Neanderthals they found. His death would mean nothing, would change nothing, would be forgotten as soon as his body stopped twitching. And Throk had promised the dead that their deaths would not be meaningless, that he would make the others remember. Revenge could wait. First, he had to survive, had to escape, had to become something no Neanderthal had ever been before. A ghost, a shadow, a witness to the ending who somehow endured beyond the ending itself. He gathered supplies quickly: a water bladder, dried meat, a spear, a stone knife, everything he could carry without being burdened. Then he moved to the cave entrance and began to descend the cliff face. The climb down was far more dangerous than the climb up had ever been. The others had used ladders and ropes and cooperation. Throk had only his strength and his intimate knowledge of stone. But his people had been climbing cliffs for 300,000 years. His body knew how to find the tiny ledges, the invisible cracks, the handholds that seemed impossible until you understood the stone's grain and structure. He descended in near silence, moving like a shadow, using the moonlight to pick his route. Below, the others' celebration continued. They had posted no sentries. Why would they? All threats were eliminated. The battle was won. The last cave was theirs. Throk reached the ground and melted into the forest without looking back. He moved north, away from the others' camp, away from the valley that had been his home, away from everything familiar, and toward a future that held no promises except continued existence. The moon was now fully risen. The night was bright enough to travel by, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, the sound echoing off the cliffs and carrying across the valley in waves. Throk paused at the sound, head tilted, listening. In his language, in his people's understanding of the world, wolves were not enemies. They were fellow hunters, fellow survivors, creatures who understood that the world was harsh and survival required strength and cunning and the will to continue even when everything seemed lost. The wolf howled again, and this time Throk answered. Not with a wolf's howl. His vocal anatomy could not produce that sound, but with his own voice. A long, low call that carried across the valley. The last voice of his species, announcing to the night that he lived, that one remained, that the ending was not quite complete. In the others' camp below, the celebration stopped. Heads turned toward the sound. Confusion rippled through the group. That had not been a wolf. That had been something else. Something that should not exist anymore. Kesh rose to his feet, his face troubled. He looked up at the dark cliff where the sealed cave lay. No, impossible. He had checked the bodies himself. They were all dead. All of them. The smoke had done its work. But even as he reassured himself, doubt wormed its way into his certainty. The Neanderthals were tough. Everyone knew this. Capable of surviving injuries that would kill Homo Sapiens. What if one had survived? What if... Send scouts, he ordered. Back to the cave. Check the seal. Make certain nothing has... But Throk was already gone, vanishing into the forest with the silence of a predator that knew how to disappear. Behind him, the others would find the gap in the stone wall, would search the forest, would hunt for the survivor with all their considerable skills. But they would not find him, not tonight, not ever,
if he was careful, because Throk had been hunting in these mountains since he could walk. And now he was no longer hunting game. He was hunting survival itself. The hour had ended. 60 minutes had passed since the wind stopped, since the attack began, since the last clan of Neanderthals began their final stand. 0 minutes remained of the time they had to escape. But one had escaped anyway. One remained. One survivor to carry forward the memory of 300,000 years into a future that wanted no part of him. Throk disappeared into the night, and with him went the last free Neanderthal. The others, if any existed, were trapped in their own valleys, facing their own sieges, fighting their own losing battles. But this one, this single male, had done what should have been impossible. He had survived the unsurvivable, had escaped the inescapable, had lived beyond the ending, and in doing so, had created a problem that Homo sapiens would spend the next several years trying to solve. What do you do with the last member of a species that refuses to die? After the last minute, epilogue, 40,000 years. Part 1. The Ghost. Days 1 through 37. Throk became something that had never existed before in the history of his species, a solitary hunter. For 300,000 years, Neanderthals had lived in family groups. They cooperated, they shared. They raised their young communally and hunted in coordinated parties. Isolation was death. No individual, no matter how strong, could survive alone for extended periods. The world was too harsh, the dangers too numerous, the demands of survival too complex for one person to manage without support. But Throk had no choice. There was no family to return to, no clan to rejoin, no other Neanderthals anywhere in this entire region, and possibly nowhere at all. He was alone in a way that transcended loneliness. He was biologically, evolutionarily alone. The last of his kind in a world that belonged to his enemies. The first days were the hardest. His body, still recovering from smoke inhalation, demanded rest that he could not afford. His mind, traumatized by the loss of everyone he had ever known, wanted to shut down, to stop processing, to simply cease. He would find himself standing motionless in the forest for periods he could not account for, his consciousness having simply stopped, for minutes or hours at a time. But the survival instinct that had kept him breathing in the smoke-filled chamber would not let him quit. His body continued moving even when his mind retreated. His hands continued gathering food even when thought became impossible. He was operating on something deeper than consciousness, on the accumulated wisdom of 300,000 years of evolution that refused to accept extinction quietly. He traveled north, staying high in the mountains where the others rarely ventured. The altitude was brutal, thin air, freezing nights even in summer, terrain that could kill with a single misstep. But Throk's body was designed for exactly these conditions. His barrel chest processed oxygen with efficiency that the others could not match. His compact, muscular frame conserved heat far better than their tall, lean bodies. In the high places, his disadvantages became advantages. He learned quickly that the others were hunting him. He found their camps, their tracks, their signs. They were searching systematically, sending out parties of scouts who combed the valleys and forests with determination that bordered on obsession. Kesh, it seemed, understood the danger of leaving even one Neanderthal alive. Understood that survivors could rebuild, could breed, could perpetuate the species he was trying to eliminate. But Throk had advantages the others could not overcome. He knew this territory intimately. Every cave, every water source, every game trail. He could read signs they missed, could move through terrain they considered impassable.
And most importantly, he was alone. One individual could hide in ways that groups never could survive on resources too meager for multiple people, could become invisible. He became a ghost, a shadow, a presence felt but never seen. The others would find his camps, but always days after he had abandoned them. Would discover his kills, but the meat would be gone, and the tracks leading away would vanish into stone or water. Would hear sounds in the night that might have been wind or might have been something else, something that watched them from the darkness with eyes that held 300,000 years of accumulated knowledge about survival. Kesh began to doubt his own memories. Had he really checked all the bodies? Had one somehow survived? Or was this paranoia, imagination, the guilt of genocide manifesting as phantom threats? His warriors were starting to fear the forests, starting to tell stories of the ghost, the last one, the Neanderthal who could not die. Stories. Already, just weeks after the cave assault, Throk was becoming mythology. Part 2. The Watcher. Months 2 through 14. As summer turned to autumn and autumn to winter, Throk's existence settled into patterns that were almost sustainable. Almost. He had found a network of small caves in the highest peaks, places too remote and difficult for the others to search regularly. He had established caches of food and supplies throughout his territory. He had learned which valleys the others occupied and which remained empty. He survived. But survival was not living. The loneliness was worse than hunger, worse than cold, worse than fear. Neanderthals were not designed for isolation. Their brains required social interaction the way their bodies required food. Throk found himself talking to the wind, to the stones, to the memory of voices that would never answer. He would wake from dreams of Mira and Kale, so vivid that for a moment he forgot they were dead, only to have reality crash back with devastating force. He began to watch the others from a distance. It was dangerous. Every scouting mission risked discovery and death. But Throk needed to see them, needed to understand them, needed to know his enemy with an intimacy that went beyond the tactical. He would spend days observing their camps, learning their routines, studying their behavior. And what he learned disturbed him profoundly. The others were not the monsters he wanted them to be. They were people. They laughed. They played with their children. They mourned their dead. They told stories around their fires, and even though Throk could not understand their language fully, he could see the gestures, could read the body language, could recognize the universal human need to make meaning through narrative. They had families, loved ones, hopes and fears and dreams. They were not evil. They were simply numerous. And in a world of limited resources, numerous meant victorious. One night, hidden on a cliff above a other's camp, Throk watched a father teaching his son to knap flint. The boy, perhaps 7 or 8 summers old, was struggling with the technique, growing frustrated as his stones shattered incorrectly. The father was patient, demonstrating again and again, correcting the boy's grip, showing him how to read the stone's grain. Throk had taught young Brock the same way, had used the same patience, had felt the same pride when the boy finally produced a usable blade. The realization that the others were not so different, that they were in essential ways the same, should have made it easier to hate them, should have made their elimination of his people seem more monstrous, more unforgivable. Instead, it made everything worse. Because if they were people,
if they were capable of love and art and teaching and all the things that made life meaningful, then what had happened to his clan was not murder. It was something far more terrible and far more banal. It was competition. Species-level competition for resources and space. And in that competition, there were no villains, only winners and losers, only the numerous and the few, only those who would inherit the future and those who would vanish into the past. Part 3. The Last Winter. Months 15 through 18. The second winter was brutal, even by the standards of someone who had survived dozens of winters. Game was scarce, the cold was relentless, and Throk's body, despite its legendary toughness, was beginning to show the strain of 18 months of solitary survival. He had lost weight, not dramatically, but enough to notice. His face had become gaunt. His hands, which had once been thick and powerful, now showed bones too clearly. He was not starving, not yet, but he was operating at a caloric deficit that could not be sustained indefinitely. And there was something else, something worse than physical decline. He was forgetting their faces. Mira's face would come to him in dreams, but it was becoming less distinct. Was her nose that shape, or was he misremembering? Were Kale's eyes exactly that shade, or was his memory filling in details that were no longer accurate? He tried desperately to hold on to every detail, but memory was not designed to preserve faces seen only in the past. Memory was designed to recognize faces seen regularly, updated constantly through continued interaction. Without anyone to remember with him, without anyone to share memories and correct his errors and keep the details fresh, his family was fading. Not from his heart, never from his heart, but from his mind's eye. And that felt like losing them all over again. One night, huddled in a cave while a blizzard raged outside, Throk made a decision that changed everything. He would paint them. He had no ochre, no proper pigments, but he had charcoal from his fires. He had his own blood, which could be mixed with fat to create a dark red paint. He had stone to scratch into, and he had the walls of the cave that would be his home for this winter. For weeks, working by firelight, Throk created the last Neanderthal art that would ever be made. He painted Mira's face, getting it wrong at first, refining it, capturing finally the curve of her jaw, the set of her eyes, the expression she wore when she was content. He painted Kale, his daughter, small and fierce with her red hair. He painted his father, Gron, scarred and wise. He painted young Brock with his spear raised in defiance. He painted the attack, the smoke, the sealed chamber, the bodies beneath their furs. He painted his escape, his survival, his endless watching from the shadows. And finally, he painted something that had not happened yet, but that he knew was inevitable. He painted himself, alone, lying still on the cave floor. He painted his death. Because Throk knew, with the certainty of someone who had watched his entire species die, that he was looking at his future. He would not live forever, could not live forever. And when he died, there would be no one to remember, no one to paint him, no one to mark his passing. So he painted himself, created his own memorial, left evidence that he had existed, that he had survived past the ending, that the last free Neanderthal had lived 18 months longer than anyone thought possible. Part 4. The Final Hunt. Month
19. Spring came reluctantly to the mountains.
The snow began to melt. Game began to return. And Throk, thin but alive, emerged from his winter cave to find the world changed again. The others had multiplied. Where before there had been 1 or 2 camps in the valleys, now there were 5, 10. Their populations were exploding, filling every available niche, claiming every hunting ground. They were not just winning the competition, they were overwhelming it through sheer reproductive success. Throk understood, finally and completely, that his survival was temporary. That no matter how clever he was, no matter how well he hid, no matter how long he lasted, the ending was inevitable. The others would continue to expand, would eventually occupy even the highest peaks, would leave no space, no matter how remote, unclaimed. He could live another year, maybe 2, but the conclusion was already written. Still, something in him refused to simply wait for death. If he was going to die, and he was, then he would die doing something meaningful, something that mattered, something that might, just might, echo across the vast gulf of time and be remembered. He would hunt one last time, not for food, not for survival, but for memory. Throk spent weeks preparing. He crafted the finest spear he had ever made, napping the point with precision that bordered on art. He gathered supplies. He studied the others' movements, learning their patterns, identifying their most important camps. And then, on a morning when the sun rose bright and clear, Throk descended from his mountain sanctuary for the last time. He moved through the forest with the silence of a lifetime's practice, past the others' outlying camps, past their sentries, into the heart of their territory, to a valley where Kesh, the leader, the architect of the cave assault, had established his primary base. Throk was not planning an attack. That would be futile. One male against dozens would die in seconds. Instead, he was planning something far more audacious. He was going to let them see him. At midday, when the camp was busy with daily activities, Throk emerged from the forest and stood in clear view on a ridge overlooking the valley. He made no threatening gestures, did not raise his spear, simply stood there, backlit by the sun, an impossible figure that should not exist. The effect was instantaneous. Someone spotted him, shouted. Others came running. Within moments, the entire camp was staring up at the ridge where the last Neanderthal stood in silent witness. Kesh emerged from his shelter, shading his eyes against the sun. Even at this distance, Throk could see the recognition on the leader's face. The shock. The realization that his genocide had been incomplete. That the ghost stories his warriors told were not superstition, but truth. For a long moment, neither moved. Hunter and survivor. Victor and witness. The representative of the future and the last voice of the past. Facing each other across a valley that represented the entire span of human evolution. Then Throk did something that would be remembered, though not understood, in the oral histories that Kesh's people would pass down through generations. He raised his hand. Not in threat, not in surrender, but in acknowledgement. A gesture that said, "I see you. I know what you did. I survived. I remember. And someone, someday, will know this happened." Then he turned and disappeared into the forest before the others could organize a pursuit. He had accomplished what he set out to do. He had made himself real to them, had proven that the last Neanderthal had lived beyond the ending, had created a memory that would persist, in some form, across the enormous gulf of time. Part 5. 40,000 years later.
In the year 2025 of the Common Era, a team of archaeologists working in southern France made an unusual discovery. In a high mountain cave, far above the valleys usually associated with prehistoric habitation, they found paintings.
The paintings were unlike any Neanderthal art previously discovered. They were more recent. Carbon dating suggested they were made approximately 39,180 years before present. The latest Neanderthal art ever found, by centuries. But it was the content that shocked the scientific community. The paintings showed faces, individual, recognizable faces, rendered with a precision that suggested intimate familiarity. A woman with distinct features, a child with carefully detailed hair, an old male with visible scars, young males with weapons raised. And then, in a sequence that suggested narrative, the paintings showed an attack. Smoke, figures lying still, and one figure, male, powerful, alone, escaping, surviving. The final painting showed the same male figure, alone in a cave, painting on walls. A self-portrait of sorts. An artist depicting himself in the act of creation. It's a memorial, the lead archaeologist said during the press conference announcing the discovery. The last Neanderthal in this region, possibly one of the last anywhere, painting the memory of his family, his clan, documenting their deaths and his survival, leaving evidence that they existed, that he existed, that the ending of his species was witnessed, even if there was no one left to witness with him. The paintings became famous, were featured in documentaries, textbooks, museums. The cave was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Millions of people viewed the images online, moved by the evidence of grief and memory and artistic expression from a species that had been extinct for 40,000 years. But there was one detail in the paintings that troubled the researchers. A detail they discussed in academic papers, but could never quite explain. In the painting of the escape, the solitary male figure was shown leaving the sealed chamber. The artists had used ochre and charcoal and what appeared to be actual blood mixed with fat to create his colors. The chemical analysis of the pigments revealed something impossible. The blood was fresh, relatively speaking. Not 40,000 years old like it should have been, but closer to 39,180 years old, which meant the artist had been painting not in 39,200 BC when the attack happened, but months or even years later, which meant someone had survived, had lived alone in the mountains, had created art not in the thriving days of his species, but in the final days, in the aftermath, in the silence after the ending. The last free Neanderthal had not died in the attack, had not been sealed in the tomb with his family, had somehow, impossibly, escaped, had survived, had wandered these mountains alone, the last of his kind, creating this memorial to the dead, and then, presumably, had died himself, alone, unmourned, unremembered except for the paintings he had left behind. The researchers searched the cave system thoroughly. They found remains, a single male skeleton in a deep recess, positioned carefully, deliberately, as if he had known death was coming and had arranged himself for it. The skeleton was massive, heavily built, showing evidence of incredible strength and numerous healed injuries. The DNA analysis confirmed what they had suspected. Homo neanderthalensis, male. Age at death, approximately 38 to 40 years old. Time of death, approximately 39,179 years before present. He had survived for 19 months after the attack. Alone, painting, remembering, ensuring that his family, his clan, his people would not vanish without leaving some evidence of their existence. The last free Neanderthal. The ghost. The survivor. The witness. His name, Throk, was lost to time. No Homo sapiens ever learned it, but his paintings survived. His memorial persisted, and 40,000 years after his death, millions of humans, descendants of the others who had killed his family, looked at his art and wept for him. They did not know they were crying for the male who had promised his dying family that their deaths would not be meaningless, that he would make the others remember. But the promise had been kept. Across the vast, impossible gulf of 40,000 years, Throk had made them remember, had made them know what was lost, had made them understand in some small way the cost of their existence. The world belonged to Homo sapiens now, belonged completely and absolutely. The Neanderthals were gone, extinct, vanished except for the trace amounts of DNA they had contributed through occasional interbreeding before their final disappearance. But in that cave in the mountains, in paintings made by a male who should not have survived, who defied extinction for 19 months longer than anyone thought possible, the Neanderthals spoke one last time. "We were here," the paintings said. "We lived. We loved. We fought. We died. And one of us survived long enough to tell you this story. Remember us." And 40,000 years later, finally, humanity did. The end. Author's note. The attack on the cave described in this narrative is fictional, but the extinction of the Neanderthals around 39,200 years ago is historical fact. The exact circumstances of their disappearance remain debated, whether through violence, competition for resources, interbreeding, or some combination of factors. What is certain is that Homo neanderthalensis, a species that had successfully occupied Europe and parts of Asia for approximately 300,000 years, vanished with remarkable speed once Homo sapiens populations began expanding into their territories. Within a few thousand years, they were gone entirely.
Some evidence suggests the process was not entirely peaceful.
Archaeological sites show sudden cessation of Neanderthal occupation coinciding with Homo sapiens' arrival. Some Neanderthal remains show evidence of violence. And the complete lack of Neanderthal-produced artifacts after approximately 39,000 years ago suggests not gradual assimilation, but rather complete replacement. Whether there were individual survivors who lived beyond the general extinction date, we cannot know. But the possibility haunts the archaeological record like a ghost. One last voice calling across an abyss of time that no one was there to hear. Until now.